We've recently looked back at the best things in the WWE Smackdown vs Raw series, and it was a fun look back, and it was a seriously tough choice just to pick one thing out of the many things that could be said about each game. And now it's time for an even tougher one, picking the worst aspects out of some of the best WWE games that have been released in the history of WWE games. Now again, it wasn't easy, but we managed to get there after going through each game once again and trying to find that one thing that just didn't click for us on our revisits back to each Smackdown vs Raw video game. So let's just start with the original Smackdown vs Raw game, which was released on the PS2 back in 2004. But before we go into that, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you're the first to know when we upload a video. Smackdown vs Raw. And when Smackdown vs Raw first hit the shelves back in 2004, fans were incredibly excited to get their hands on the successor to Smackdown Here Comes the Pain, a game which revolutionized WWE games forever. So now it was Smackdown vs Raw's time to take the WWE Games series to the next level, but fans of the series were quick to notice that something was amiss after putting time into the brand new game. The transition from Here Comes the Pain saw the removal of some features that fans had loved in Here Comes the Pain. Gone were the days when you could have crazy hardcore matches that would break out into any backstage area, which had a ton of interactive spots within. Weapons would now also randomly vanish after just a measly 4 uses, victory scenes were also randomly cut from the game, and the season mode felt more linear than past season modes, which was thanks to the new but restrictive voice-acted cutscenes. The game may have gained superstar voiceovers, but it lost the interactive backstage freedom and flexible career paths that allowed us to feel like we were truly living out a WWE Superstars season. The loss within season mode was a big one for players who had enjoyed that level of freedom of the previous installments. You could no longer drop by the GM's office to negotiate whether you could go after a title or just decide that you wanted to switch shows to either Raw or Smackdown on a whim. Fans had to choose whether it was worth having voiceovers and having a true season mode experience that we once had in Shut Your Mouth and Here Comes the Pain. It was certainly a trade-off that left many wondering if Smackdown vs Raw had lost as much as it gained. Smackdown vs Raw 2006. The Smackdown vs Raw 2006 hit a high note for many players, garnering high critic reviews, sales and player responses, except for one very strange decision that was met when it came to the unlockables within the game. Smackdown vs Raw 2006 was the debut for the PSP version of the game, and Jake the Snake Roberts was exclusive to the PSP unless you did a certain thing. Getting your hands on the legendary superstar required you to go through a convoluted process involving both the PSP and the PS2 versions of the game, and a system link cable. Now you had to own both a PSP and a PSP copy of Smackdown vs Raw 2006 and then go through the process of unlocking Jake the Snake in the game, and then you'd also have to own a PS2 and a PS2 copy of Smackdown vs Raw 2006. After all that, you simply link up the PSP to the PS2 and import the unlocked Jake the Snake Roberts. This felt like a blatant cash grab, locking a legend that many people wanted to play as behind a portable console wall and left a very sour taste in the community's mouth. It was a move that seemed less about doing something innovative and new, but more about pushing up the sales of both versions of the game, a practice which was not too popular among the WWE Games fanbase. It was a major letdown for fans who had already purchased the PS2 version expecting a full roster at their fingertips, well after unlocking everyone of course. Instead they found themselves either double dipping into their wallets or missing out altogether. Unsurprisingly, this was not done in the next year's game Smackdown vs Raw 07 or in any other WWE games. But what did Smackdown vs Raw 2007 do wrong? Well, let's find out. A Smackdown vs Raw 2007 came with the promise of a brand new era for WWE games with a revamped control scheme and next-gen wrestling gaming for the first time ever, but instead it delivered a test of patience with its painfully long load times. Whether you were on PS2, whether it felt like an eternity, or on PSP, where it was somehow even slower, the excitement of jumping into the ring or creating a character, designing your locker room, or even going to the match options menu was often affected by the long waiting times. You know this game was load time heavy when even basic menu navigation became a load time. It was an aspect of the game that detracted from an otherwise stellar WWE video game. And even despite the advancements in graphics and hardware, the load times were still a glaring issue on the Xbox 360 version. Although they felt much quicker and you had played the PS2 or PSP versions first, it was something that had to be worked on and was eventually in future WWE games. And check out Smackdown vs Raw 2011 for example. Those load times would feel like PS5 level load times when compared to Smackdown vs Raw 07. Sure, we miss the good old days of wrestling games, but we sure don't miss waiting 15 seconds for a victory scene to load, that's for sure. Smackdown vs Raw 2008. And then there was SmackDown vs Raw 2008's 24/7 mode, which tried to blend season and general manager modes but ended up pleasing fans of neither. Specifically, we want to discuss the season mode aspect of 24/7 mode. The attempt to innovate just felt super flat with repetitive scenes and a season mode that just honestly felt like a slog to play through and progress. The mode was littered with recycled content that failed to captivate, and what was supposed to be a flagship feature turned into the game's most significant downfall. Sure, there were a few storylines within this season mode that were good stories that were worth playing out, but they were buried under a heap of tiresome repetition that filled out this mode. This mode is often remembered as a low point in the series when compared to other season modes at the time. It was a stark contrast to the excitement and variety that WWE Games season modes were known for. SmackDown vs Raw 2009. Now moving to SVR09, we saw the introduction of the horrific career mode, which was just added due to Road to WrestleMania only allowing you to pick between 6 superstars due to its narrative and character-based driven stories. A career mode that lets you pick anyone as an alternative to Road to WrestleMania is a good idea, if done right. But this mode was done all wrong. There were no storylines, no exciting rivalries, just a sequence of matches to grind through for a shot at the title that you chose to go after. It felt like a quickly tacked on mode rather than a fully fleshed out feature, and for the series that had such high standards, this was a notable disappointment. Career mode's lack of depth and creativity was a misstep for the series that had previously excelled at doing career modes right. Road to WrestleMania was done right, but this wasn't. Players who were looking for a narrative-driven mode of earlier titles were left puzzled at what this mode even was. It was a strong reminder that not all new features are improvements, marking career mode's inclusion as the worst thing in SVR09. SmackDown vs Raw 2010. Unbelievably, career mode made a return to SVR10, unchanged and as unloved as ever. It felt like an afterthought, overshadowing what was an otherwise solid entry into the series. But because we wanted each game to have their own individual worst thing, then look no further than the limitations imposed on that year's newly added creator story. The restriction of using created characters only 10 times within a story really did stifle creativity and left story creators wanting less restrictions with their created characters. If you remember creator story mode, then you'll remember that the 10 appearances is nothing. You'd go through those quickly. It'd be like Brock Lesnar or Roman Reigns mode, or something with how many limited dates that character has. This limitation put a down on what was a truly revolutionary mode which allowed us players to create engaging stories, or the goofiest kinds of stories we could think of. The creator story limitations would thankfully be lifted in future WWE games. SmackDown vs Raw 2011. And finally, SmackDown vs Raw 2011's Universe mode was a big hit with players and has become one of the pillars of the new WWE 2K video games. But even then, Universe wasn't immune to criticism when it debuted in SVR11. Early versions of the mode suffered the repetitive scenes that wore thin very quickly. The infamous superstar in the crowd with a ticket cutscene became the punchline of the game's repetitive cutscenes, and while it's looked back on now as a humorous moment and even nostalgic at times, it was an annoyance that players would bring up constantly when going over the negatives of Universe mode. Despite the cutscene repetition, Universe mode was a strong addition, but the lack of scene variety was what made the next Universe mode in WWE 12 that much stronger, as it boasted an array of brand new cutscenes on the top of the old ones from SVR 11, which allowed for more variety. Though it's funny to mention that many of the old annoying cutscenes of the past are now looked back on as ones that should be in the new games after being removed a long time ago. But there you have it, folks, the worst thing of every SmackDown vs Raw game. What do you guys think? Do you agree? Let us know in the comments down below, and I'll see you next time with some more wrestling video game content.